Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're embarking on, well, a really fascinating journey into some uncharted historical waters. You sent us quite the treasure chest of sources, articles, research papers, even some Reddit threads, and they all seem to be asking this powerful question. What was sexuality really like for pirates? And, how much of that history has been, well, maybe buried? So, our mission today is to try and unearth some of these hidden narratives of queer lives across history. We're going to look specifically at the golden age of piracy, sure, but also the complexities of sexual identity in the past generally, and how and why certain stories seem to get deliberately silenced or maybe distorted. We're going to really try and unpack terms like hetero-washing and queer erasure and explore how our modern understanding of sexuality might actually be misleading us when we look back.
Yeah, what's so compelling here, I think, is that it's not just about pirates, right? We're sort of using their unique context, their world, to understand these broader patterns of historical suppression. We've been navigating through some pretty dense historical material, definitely. But the goal is really to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and hopefully challenge some assumptions you might have about history. You might just have genuine aha moments along the way.
Okay, diving right in then. Our sources immediately challenge how we even think about history, don't they? Like when we look back at, say, a pirate from the 17th century, can we really use our modern words like gay or straight to describe them? Does that even work?
That's probably the first crucial point we really need to establish. Applying modern concepts like gay or straight as these fixed identities to historical periods, especially before the 19th century. Well, it's anachronistic, it can be deeply misleading. The actual terms homosexuality and heterosexuality as these distinct identities we think of now, they didn't even emerge until the mid-19th century. And they weren't really cemented in popular culture until like the mid-20th century. It's surprisingly recent.
Oh, really? Mid-20th?
Yeah. And get this, the word heterosexuality itself, when it was first defined in Dorland's Medical Dictionary in 1901, it was defined as an abnormal or perverted appetite toward the opposite sex.
Wow, abnormal.
Abnormal. It only became seen as normal in that dictionary by 1934. So this linguistic shift, it just clearly shows how our very language around sex and attraction is a social construct. It's not timeless, not fixed.
Yeah, that linguistic shift is just, it's powerful, isn't it? It really highlights how something we think of as fundamental, our understanding of sexuality, is actually built by society over time.
Absolutely. It reminds me of Kinsey, who noted that the whole societal division into a hetero center and homo margin, that wasn't nature's doing, but society's.
Yep.
And it was often used specifically to, well, denigrate homosexuals.
So, okay, if our modern labels don't fit, how did people understand sex and relationships back then? What were the frameworks they were working with?
Well, in the 17th and 18th centuries, terms like sodomy or buggery, they were about behavior and act, not about who you were as a person, not an identity. In fact, even a heterosexual couple could technically be accused of sodomy if the act wasn't procreative.
Huh.
Yeah. The focus was on non-procreative acts and, very importantly, transgressing gender roles, what was seen as manly or womanly behavior. And before the 18th century, you had this thing called the one-sex theory, which was pretty prevalent.
One sex there.
Yeah, it basically saw sex more as a spectrum. And one's role in the sexual act, like penetrative versus receptive, was often seen as more significant than the biological sex of the partner. So a man taking the penetrative role was often considered normal, regardless of the partner's gender.
That feels like a completely different way of viewing things.
Yeah.
Which makes this next bit really interesting. The Buggery Act of 1533 in England imposed the death penalty. Yet you have figures like John Hervey, this openly bisexual British courtier, and apparently he faced no serious punishment. How do historians square that circle? That seems like a huge contradiction.
It does, doesn't it? And it reveals this really complex interplay of, the law on the books, actual social tolerance, and definitely class. Status mattered. But the really crucial insight here, the big shift, was moving from sodomy as an act to seeing the sodomite as a perceived type of person and identity. That happened more in the 18th century. And that meant a growing policing, not just of what people did, but who they were perceived to be, which made life much more tenuous, as one source put it, especially for non-elite people who didn't fit the norms.
Right, so the focus shifted from act to identity.
Exactly. And paradoxically, it's those very legal records, like the Old Bailey court documents you mentioned, that sometimes give us the only glimpses we have. They're the main way historians can try and reconstruct these hidden sexual cultures, precisely because these things were being policed and recorded, even negatively.
It's so ironic, isn't it? The tools of suppression become the sources of recovery. Okay, so we firmly establish our modern labels just don't map neatly onto the past. Let's take that understanding now and apply it directly to the pirates. Were they gay or straight, or is that still the wrong question?
It's largely the wrong question, yeah.
Yeah.
The academic consensus is pretty clear. Applying modern categories like that is anachronistic for the golden age of piracy. There's really no evidence that pirates differed from the general public on the matter of sexuality.
Okay.
The real challenge, though, is the nature of historical inquiry itself when you're looking at topics that were actively suppressed, hidden, or just not talked about openly.
Okay, but what about the stories? You hear things like pirates marrying each other. Is there anything to that? Or is it just, modern projection?
No, there's definitely something to that. It likely refers to matelotage.
Matelotage, okay.
Yeah, it was this unique, quite formal male partnership. It was common among pirates and buccaneers, especially in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Matelots, as they were called. They shared property, they inherited from each other, they provided companionship, fought side by side. And interestingly, the term matelot itself, it actually means bedmate.
Bedmate. Okay, that sounds suggestive.
It does, right. And historians really debate the full meaning of matelotage. Some argue it was purely practical, financial, like an insurance policy at sea. And they point out correctly that some pirates in these arrangements were also married to women on land. We need to be careful not to erase potential bi or pan experiences.
Good point.
But others argue it had clearly homosexual characteristics, that it could be affectionate, financial, and sexual. Much like modern marriages, as one historian put it. So, the common idea that pirates sometimes married each other, it's a legitimate historical fact, grounded in matelotage. Even if the exact nature of every bond remains, well, ambiguous. We do have some tantalizing examples like John Beavis and Francis Reed, who apparently entered in courtship together in a 1699 document, or Captain Louis Le Goleff, his partner Pulverin, was reportedly distraught when Le Goleff married a woman, and Pulverin actually claimed his rights to the marriage chamber.
Wow. Claimed his rights.
Yeah. So the takeaway isn't just about slapping on labels, it's seeing how different historical contexts allowed for these incredibly rich, complex bonds that just don't fit neatly into our modern boxes.
That makes sense. And given that piracy itself was about rejecting conventional society, rejecting civilized life, did that rejection maybe extend to sexual norms too? Did they create a space that was genuinely different?
It seems they certainly rejected some societal restrictions. French pirates on Tortuga, for example, were apparently considered more tolerant of same-sex relationships than folks back on the mainland. But, and this is important, this freedom wasn't absolute or uniform. You have figures like Captain Bartholomew Roberts, who notoriously banned women and boys from his ship, and he supposedly executed anyone who broke that rule. Pirate culture also often really valued hyper-masculine behavior.
So it wasn't just a free-for-all.
Not at all. Tolerance seems to have been situational, complex, varied from ship to ship, captain to captain. There's also this idea of situational homosexuality. The suggestion that same-sex acts happen simply because you had these all-male environments, like ships or prisons. But scholars caution against overstating that specifically for pirates. Their voyages were often shorter than, say, long prison sentences, and they did go ashore frequently. It wasn't total isolation for years on end.
Right. Okay, so if these acts, these relationships, whatever form they took, were happening, why don't we have more explicit records? Why is it so hard to find direct proof?
Well, the short answer is the severe legal environment. Sodomy was illegal. It was punishable by death across the highly Christian Atlantic world at the time. That kind of severe legal threat means explicit evidence is naturally going to be scarce. People weren't writing diaries about it generally. What evidence we do have often comes from court records, precisely because someone got caught doing something illegal. So, as historians often have to remind us, absence of evidence doesn't mean it was not a thing. It often just means it was dangerous to document or leave traces.
It's a critical point for any history of marginalized groups, really. Okay, let's shift slightly. What about the famous female pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read? Their story just inherently challenges the usual male-dominated picture of piracy.
Absolutely. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, they famously disguised themselves as men to live and fight as pirates. That alone is remarkable. The story goes that Bonny confessed her gender and romantic interest to Read, believing Read was a man. Read then revealed she was also a woman and supposedly reciprocated. Later, they joined Captain John Calico Jack Rackham's crew, and some accounts suggest a polyamorous relationship between the three of them.
Polyamorous, okay.
Now, popular culture often loves to portray them as exclusively lesbian. But the historical reality is, as one source states, There are no records detailing the sexuality of pirate women. We just don't know for sure. Making definitive conclusions is impossible. But their story absolutely offers this fascinating glimpse into potential female same-sex relationships, or at least significant gender transgression, in this really extraordinary setting.
So, given all this nuance, the anachronistic labels, the scarce evidence, the complexities of Matelotage, the unique case of Bonny and Reed, what stands out to you about how popular culture portrays queer pirates today? Thinking about shows like, say, Black Sails or Our Flag Means Death, how do they handle this?
Yeah, those are great examples. Shows like Black Sails, you have Captain Flint's Romance, characters like Max and Eleanor, and Our Flag Means Death, which is built around Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard, plus characters like Jim Jimenez. They explicitly depict queer characters and relationships.
Sure.
Now, historically speaking, that kind of overt display of sexuality would likely have been highly exceptional and surprising to people at the time. It probably wouldn't have been that open.
Right, because of the danger we talked about.
Exactly. And while some viewers initially criticized these queer elements in the shows, maybe calling them overly activist or historically inaccurate in that sense, for many other viewers, that inclusion is now a huge part of the appeal, a major draw. These portrayals often seem to use piracy as a kind of metaphor for queer resistance, finding chosen family, expressing joy outside of societal norms. And that really reflects a contemporary desire, I think, for more diverse and visible representation within historical narratives.
That makes sense. It feels like this hetero-washing of pirate history, this tendency to ignore or downplay these elements until recently. It's part of a much bigger pattern, isn't it? Maybe we should clarify for listeners, what exactly do historians mean by hetero-washing and queer erasure in this context?
Sure, good idea. Hetero-washing is essentially the process, often unconscious but sometimes deliberate, of portraying historical figures, groups, or periods as exclusively heterosexual.
Yeah.
Even when there's evidence suggesting otherwise, or, as we've discussed, when their understanding of sexuality was just fundamentally different from ours. And queer erasure is the broader phenomenon minimizing, denying, or just completely omitting the existence and contributions of LGBTQ plus people throughout history.
And you're saying this isn't just about pirates?
Oh, absolutely not. It's a really pervasive thing across different eras, different cultures, and it's often intertwined with other patterns of marginalization, like the whitewash in history that erases or downplays the contributions of people of color or indigenous nations. It's about who gets remembered and how. And the irony is, we have evidence suggesting queer people lived, thrived, and been celebrated in many ancient civilizations. You find hints in ancient cave paintings in ancient Egypt across various indigenous cultures. Greek and Roman mythology is full of fluid understandings. Apollo, sometimes seen as a patron of same-sex love. Dionysus as a patron god of hermaphrodites and transvestites. Even the worship of Aphroditos, a blended figure. And that one-sex theory we mentioned, that was common for much of the Middle Ages too.
So this idea of a strictly binary, strictly heterosexual past is just wrong.
Pretty much, yeah. The Middle Ages themselves weren't inherently heterosexual. That term sodomy, again, it covered various non-procreative sex acts. Condemnation was often more about transgressing gender roles than the sex of the partner per se. And penalties varied wildly: fines, public shaming, sometimes burning at the stake. It depended hugely on time, place, and social status. And again, it's those legal records, the records of punishment, that sometimes inadvertently give us clues about these hidden histories.
It truly is ironic, isn't it? The systems designed to suppress end up creating the only paper trail historians can follow sometimes.
Exactly. And these tactics of erasure, they just kept evolving. In more modern times, think about something like the Motion Picture Production Code, the Hays Code from 1930 to 1968. It basically eliminated openly gay characters from mainstream films, which led creators to use subtle queer coding to hint at characters' identities. Gore Vidal famously talked about doing this for Ben-Hur.
Right, the subtext.
The subtext, yeah. And historical figures got straight-washed, too. Alan Turing's sexuality was downplayed for decades after his Vital War work. Tchaikovsky's letters explicitly mentioning his relationships with men were censored until 2018.
2018, wow.
Yeah. Prominent lesbian suffragettes had their relationships denied or minimized, even major newspapers like the New York Times. One source noted they had very few positive front-page articles about gay people until the mid-1980s.
And even today, you hear criticisms sometimes that contemporary pride events can get straight-washed by corporate sponsors, kind of diluted to be more palatable for the masses.
So it's an ongoing process. It seems to be. It all operates on this principle that fundamentally, history does not remember what it does not value. People with power, institutions with power, They tend to determine whose stories are seen as important, whose stories belong to the dominant narrative. And this lack of value, this historical silencing, leads to invisibility. It fuels the damaging myth that queer people are somehow a recent invention, a modern phenomenon, which in turn makes it easier to justify discrimination today. We see echoes of that in legislation targeting trans and intersex kids right now. The lack of perceived history is used against them.
That's a powerful connection between historical erasure and present-day harm. Okay, we've talked about pirates, their specific context, and this broader pattern of historical erasure. Now let's try to tackle a particularly challenging and often underdocumented area, the intersection of all this with slavery. Specifically thinking about pirates, homosexuality, and slavery. What can our sources even tell us here? It feels incredibly difficult.
It is incredibly difficult. Reconstructing intimate details of historical same-sex relations is hard enough. When it involves enslaved individuals, it becomes exceptionally challenging. You have the pervasive taboos around same-sex acts, the criminalization we've discussed, plus the fundamental lack of agency of enslaved people to document their own lives and experiences. So unsurprisingly, there's a real notable absence of explicit documentation about consensual same-sex relationships, specifically between pirates and enslaved individuals.
And the word consensual feels almost impossible to use there anyway, right?
Exactly. That's the overriding factor. Power dynamics. The fundamental reality of slavery is an extreme, violent power imbalance. Any sexual interaction involving an enslaved person is fundamentally shaped by coercion. The concept of consent, as we understand it, is essentially meaningless in that context. So even if same-sex acts did occur between, say, a pirate and an enslaved person, we absolutely cannot equate that with homosexuality in a way that implies mutual desire, agency, or choice for the enslaved party. It's fundamentally different.
That's a profoundly important distinction to make. So, stepping back from sexuality for a moment, how did pirates interact with enslaved people more generally? The sources paint a complicated picture, don't they?
Incredibly complicated, yes. On one hand, many pirates were absolutely involved in the slave trade. They plundered slave ships, they treated enslaved people as cargo to be sold. Blackbeard's famous ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was originally a French slave vessel, La Concorde.
Right.
However, and this is a significant nuance, some pirates did free enslaved people they captured. They allowed them to join their crews. This offered a very rare, albeit dangerous, path to a form of freedom, sometimes referred to as the choice between sword or slave.
So black individuals were actually part of pirate crews.
Yes, significantly so. Some estimates suggest that up to 1/3 of all pirates during the Golden Age may have been formerly enslaved individuals of African descent. Now, conditions varied. Some were undoubtedly still mistreated, but other captains reportedly established a kind of revolutionary equality among their crews, at least relative to the norms on land. On some ships, black pirates could vote in ships' matters, bear arms, and receive an equal share of the booty, regardless of race. We know of figures like John Julian, who is Samuel Bellamy's pilot and seemingly a respected crew member.
But what happened if these integrated crews were caught? Was justice applied equally then?
Almost never. Sadly, if captured, black pirates usually faced much harsher fates than their white counterparts. Often, they were simply returned to former owners or resold into slavery, which many probably considered a fate worse than execution. Although, interestingly, one record shows 5 black members of Blackbeard's crew were executed alongside their white crewmates in 1719. So sometimes they share the same grim end.
It's just layer upon layer of complexity.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we have to reiterate the nuance. While some pirate ships offer this kind of revolutionary quality, it was often pragmatic, driven by the need for skilled manpower on deck, not always by a deep ideological stance against slavery itself. The fact that many of these same pirates still participated in the slave trade shows the inherent contradictions. Their idea of freedom was often limited and conditional.
Okay, so that's the pirate side.
Yeah.
What about the other direction? Do we know anything about same-sex relationships among enslaved individuals themselves, or even, however fraught, between slaveholders and enslaved people?
Yes, despite the absolutely brutal conditions of slavery, there is evidence suggesting same-sex relationships did exist among enslaved people. For instance, sources mention enslaved men in Cuba calling each other camarada, or even marido, husband. The homosocial environments, like all-male work gangs, likely made male-male intimacy or acts almost inevitable for some. There's also some suggestive evidence, often veiled, of interactions, maybe even long-term relationships, between white male slaveholders and the enslaved men who served as their personal attendants or valets. But again, and we have to keep stressing this, these occurred within that inescapable system of coercion. Any perceived affection or longevity in such a relationship cannot negate the fundamental power imbalance and lack of true consent.
Understood. That power dynamic is just inescapable. Wow, this deep dive has really, really challenged assumptions, I think. About history, about sexuality, about pirates, about whose stories get told. What stands out to you, the listener, from all of this? It's a lot to process.
It is a lot. I think the biggest takeaway is that understanding historical sexuality means we have to move way beyond our rigid modern labels. They just don't fit neatly. Sodomy was primarily an act, not an identity back then. And unique practices like matelotage show these complex, often ambiguous, but clearly significant male bonds among pirates. Bonds that existed in a world apart from strict land-based laws. And the scarcity of explicit evidence. It isn't proof these things didn't happen. It's usually a reflection of deliberate historical oppression and silence.
Right. And that hetero-washing, that pattern of queer erasure, it wasn't just about pirates. We saw it's this systemic thing found across pretty much all historical periods and cultures we looked at.
Exactly. From ancient myths that showed fluidity, through medieval laws focusing on acts and gender roles, right up to modern film censorship, and even how pride can be marketed today. Power structures have consistently shaped whose stories get valued, remembered, and passed down. And that painful intersection with slavery just starkly reminds us how extreme power dynamics fundamentally reshape the meaning of any sexual interaction, removing the possibility of genuine consent.
So, wrapping this all up, what does this mean for us today as we try to understand our own world, our own identities, and look back at history?
Well, I think it leads to a provocative thought. The historical erasure of queer people, this consistent silencing, it creates the damaging perception of queer individuals today being a person without precedent, as if they just appeared out of nowhere recently. And that perception makes it easier to marginalize communities, to deny rights, to argue they aren't natural or historical. So, as you, the listener, continue to learn and think about history, maybe consider how the narratives we choose to tell and the ones we choose to uncover and remember about the past, how they directly impact the struggle for justice and recognition for communities today. By uncovering and teaching these complex, messy, nuanced histories, pirates included, we don't just correct the historical record. We provide vital precedent. We challenge current prejudices. We assert the fundamental right of all individuals throughout all time to exist, to thrive, and to be fully recognized in the human story. Golden Age of piracy, famous for dressing as men, fighting alongside men, and having this incredibly close bond.
And what's so interesting is how their lives, even though the historical evidence is pretty limited in places,
Right.
they still serve as the main historical touchstone for this whole lesbian pirate idea. You've got Anne Bonny, described as this rowdy tomboy, apparently even burned down her father's plantation.
Wow.
And Mary Read, who cross-dressed as Mark from childhood, initially to get an inheritance, but continued it, both just clearly defied conventional gender roles of the time.
And the cross-dressing wasn't just about disguise for being a pirate, was it?
No, not entirely. I mean, it was practical, certainly for work and fighting, but it was also a pretty significant act of defiance against those superstitions, you know, the ones that said women were bad luck on ships.
Okay, but what about their relationship? What do the primary sources actually say? Like Captain Charles Johnson's book, The General History of the Pirates.
Johnson's book is key here, though we have to remember it's not without its own biases and embellishments. But yes, he describes them as being joined at the hip, living together in Calico Jack Rackham's quarters.
Right.
And then there's that really pivotal scene he describes where Calico Jack supposedly bursts in and finds Anne poised over an undressed and obviously female Mark in bed.
Okay, that sounds pretty suggestive. How have historians traditionally dealt with that scene?
Well, that's where interpretation gets tricky. More traditional historians often try to sort of straighten up the narrative, as some critics put it, meaning they assert that in that moment, Anne had only just discovered Mary was female, that it was a shock. But critics argue that interpretation is, quote, completely ridiculous given how intimately they'd been living. I mean, they shared quarters.
And didn't Mary kill one of Anne's ex-lovers?
Apparently out of jealousy, yes.
Yeah.
Which, you know, suggests a pretty intense connection. These attempts to kind of downplay or reframe their bond really highlight a potential systemic bias in historical writing, where relationships that don't fit the heterosexual norm get minimized.
Right, or explained away.
Exactly. And then there's the whole pregnancy plea to escape execution, both claiming pregnancy at the same time, which seems, well, highly unlikely, according to some analyses.
It adds another layer of complexity.
It does. And the fact they kept cross-dressing even after everyone knew they were women, It suggests something deeper than just disguise, maybe a conscious rejection of what, a woman was supposed to be back then.
Okay, this is fascinating. But before we dive deeper into other pirates, maybe we should take a step back. We need to understand how people even thought about sexuality back then.
Absolutely crucial point.
We use terms like gay or straight so easily today, but did those concepts even exist in the 17th, 18th centuries?
Not in the way we understand them now, no. Applying modern concepts like gay or straight as fixed sexual identities to that period, especially before the 19th century, is really anachronistic. It's imposing our framework onto the past.
Right, it just doesn't fit.
The terms homosexuality and heterosexuality as these distinct categories of personhood, they didn't really emerge until the mid-19th century, and they weren't common in popular culture until maybe the mid-20th century.
So what words did they use? How did they talk about it?
The most common terms you'll find are sodomy and buggery.
Okay.
Now, here's the really key difference. These were understood primarily as behaviors, as acts, not as defining someone's fundamental identity.
Oh, okay, so it wasn't I am this, but I did this.
Pretty much. Sodomy, for instance, was often a broader term. It could cover any non-procreative sexual act, including those between men, but sometimes even heterosexual couples could be accused if the act wasn't aimed at conception.
Really?
Yes. And often the focus wasn't just on the sex act itself, but on the transgression of gender roles. So a man taking what was seen as a receptive role in sex might be condemned as effeminate or unmanly, rather than being labeled homosexual in our modern sense.
Interesting.
It kind of ties into the older one-sex theory that was prevalent before the 18th century, which saw sex more as a spectrum, with women often viewed as sort of imperfect versions of men. Gender nonconformity was a big part of the perceived transgression.
Wow, so the understanding of the body itself was different, influencing how they viewed these acts.
Definitely. And it shows the power of naming, too. Think about heterosexuality. That word was actually defined as abnormal or perverted sexual passion in a 1901 medical dictionary.
No way.
Yes. It only shifted to mean normal sexuality by 1934. So these categories, they evolved.
Okay, so acts, not identities. But these acts, sodomy, buggery, they were illegal, right?
Yeah.
Seriously illegal.
Oh, extremely. The legal penalties were severe, often death in places like England, the Netherlands. They had infamous purges like the Utrecht sodomy trials. And Spain, at least before 1822. This meant that for anyone not part of the elite, discretion and concealment were absolutely paramount. It made their lives, as one historian put it, much more tenuous.
So discovery was potentially lethal.
For many, yes. France was actually a notable exception there. They decriminalized same-sex acts much earlier in 1791 during the Revolution.
Okay, so you have this really intense legal and social pressure on land. What happens when you get onto a pirate ship? Life there is already outside the law, outside normal society. Did that create a different kind of space?
That's the big question, isn't it? You have this almost entirely male environment, often for months, even years at sea.
Yeah, isolated.
Isolated and deliberately rejecting many land-based laws and social norms. These unique conditions, well, they could certainly lead to what gets called situational homosexuality, same-sex acts happening out of circumstance or lack of other options.
Okay.
But there's also something more structured, more interesting. The institution of matelotage.
Matelotage, okay, I've heard that term. Let's unpack that. What exactly was it?
Right, so matelotage was this formal union. It was pretty prevalent and seemingly well-respected among pirates and buccaneers, particularly in the Caribbean during the 17th and 18th century.
A formal union, like how formal?
Well, partners, called matelots, would often formally agree to share everything. All their property, their loot. They'd inherit from each other if one died. They provided companionship. They fought side by side.
Wow.
And the term itself, matelot, it comes from Middle Dutch, and it literally means bedmate.
Bedmate, okay, that's pretty direct. So was it like a pirate marriage? Is that a fair way to think about it?
That common saying, that pirates married one another, it seems to be a legitimate historical fact based on matelotage. But the exact nature of every single one of these relationships remains, well, ambiguous.
Ambiguous how?
Historians debate it. Was it purely a practical financial arrangement, like an insurance policy for dangerous work? Or did it often have, as some argue, clearly homosexual characteristics?
Are there specific examples that suggest more than just business?
Oh, yes. We have documented cases. John Beavis and Francis Reed, for instance, had a 1699 agreement that explicitly said they are in courtship together. Courtship.
That's pretty explicit language.
It is. Or take John Swan and Robert Culliford. Swan was described as a great consort of Culliford's who lives with him. And after they both got pardons, Culliford specifically asked Swan to join him.
So just a strong personal bond.
Definitely. And maybe the most dramatic example is Captain Louis Le Gollif and his mate Olaudah Pulverin. When Le Gollif got married to a woman, Pulverin was apparently distraught, stormed into the marriage chamber claiming his rights, and sought revenge on the wife.
Okay, that definitely sounds like more than just an insurance policy.
It really points towards a spectrum of intimacy, doesn't it? Now, some Matelots were also married to women back on land, which suggests maybe polyamory or bisexual dynamics for some. But the fact that pirate crews generally accepted these Matelotage unions seems to indicate a very pragmatic, adaptive approach to their social world.
So was pirate culture genuinely more tolerant of same-sex relationships or just practical about life at sea?
That's the million-dollar question, really. Pragmatism versus tolerance. What's notable is that pirate articles, their codes of conduct, they generally lack the explicit bans on same-sex relations that you found in, say, the Royal Navy's Articles of War. The Navy specified death for sodomy. Pirates mostly didn't include that.
Interesting omission. But wait, didn't some famous pirate captains like Bartholomew Roberts specifically ban women and boys from their ships? Sometimes even with the death penalty for seduction?
Yes, Roberts did have clauses like that, but those are often interpreted more as measures to maintain order and prevent fights or distractions, rather than a specific condemnation of same-sex acts between adult men on the crew.
Ah, okay. More about discipline.
Possibly. And ironically, Roberts himself is sometimes linked with his surgeon, George Wilson. There's an account describing Wilson as being very alert and cheerful upon unexpectedly reuniting with Roberts after a separation, hinting at a close bond. And there's another case, the privateer George Shelvach, who apparently promoted a young, unqualified pirate to first mate purely because of their personal relationship. And the source notes this kind of thing was not that uncommon.
So personal, possibly sexual relationships could influence things like rank.
Seems so. Suggests these bonds were woven into the fabric of life on some ships.
Okay, so if Matelotage existed, and these hints of relationships are there, why don't we know more? Why is it so hard to get, definitive proof or detailed accounts?
The silence itself is incredibly telling. There's a great quote. "History does not remember what it does not value."
Oof. Yeah.
During this whole era, as we discussed, same-sex acts were heavily stigmatized, often capital crimes on land and certainly in official navies. This severe legal condemnation meant that explicit contemporary evidence, especially evidence framed positively as a relationship, is just incredibly scarce.
So what little evidence exists is probably in court records, framed as a crime.
Exactly. Court-martials, trial transcripts, that's where you might find mentions, but always in a negative criminal context, not as, a love story or a partnership.
So it's not necessarily that it didn't happen frequently, but that it wasn't recorded as something acceptable, or maybe it was even deliberately erased.
Precisely. That's what's often called queer erasure. And it's a pervasive issue, far beyond just pirates. We see it throughout history. Oh, think about how ancient Greek or Roman fluid attitudes towards sexuality were later reinterpreted through more rigid frameworks. Or medieval Europe's broad sodomy laws that lumped many things together. Even decades.
Right. The Hays Code.
Exactly. And even famous individuals, Alan Turing's homosexuality was often downplayed in early accounts of his life. Composer Tchaikovsky's letters, which expressed homosexual feelings, they remained censored in Russia until 2018.
2018, wow.
Yeah. So this deliberate suppression or just neglect is why historians like B.R. Burg, who wrote a book arguing for widespread homosexuality among Caribbean buccaneers, why he faced so much criticism.
Why was he criticized?
Because direct, unambiguous proof is so rare. He had to rely a lot on inference, reading between the lines, speculation based on the context. Critics labeled his work almost entirely of pure speculation and said he made a lot of assumptions. The lack of smoking gun evidence makes it a challenging field.
Okay, this brings us back then to Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Given this context of erasure and the difficulty of proof, is that popular image of them as lesbian pirates? Is it more myth than documented fact?
In terms of explicit contemporary historical record, unfortunately, yes, it leans more towards myth or perhaps hopeful interpretation.
So Johnson's journal history hints at intimacy.
It continually hints towards intimacy, yes. But the actual trial transcripts from their capture, contemporary newspaper accounts, They provide no evidence of a romantic or sexual relationship between Anne and Mary.
They were both documented as being involved with men, right?
Yes, both were legally married to men, and Anne famously had the affair with Calico Jack. The popular lesbian angle seems to really take off later in romance novels and plays, probably inspired by their undeniable cross-dressing and their defiance of gender norms.
So it's a case where a compelling narrative, maybe fueled by a modern desire for representation, kind of overshadows the more ambiguous historical reality.
I think that's a fair assessment. It shows how powerful myth can be. And you see similar things with other figures, like the supposed Pierre the Pansy Pirate. His actual existence is debated, let alone his sexuality, and the pansy label likely comes from interpretations of him owning businesses seen as feminine at the time.
This whole discussion raises another really important and very sensitive question. We talked about gender, but what about race? Pirate ships were often diverse. Did any of these same-sex relationships or even matelotage involve enslaved people?
This is an extremely sensitive and complex area, and it's really crucial to be clear upfront. The historical sources provide no direct accounts detailing consensual homosexual relationships, specifically between pirates and enslaved individuals.
Okay, and the emphasis there is on consensual. Why is that distinction so critical here?
Because the absolute core issue is the extreme power imbalance inherent in slavery. Sexual exploitation of both women and men was a systemic, ubiquitous part of enslavement.
It was built into the system.
Absolutely. Any sexual interaction involving an enslaved person, regardless of the gender of either party, is fundamentally shaped by that coercive imbalance. The very concept of consent, as we understand it, is essentially meaningless in that context.
Right, because refusal could have dire consequences.
Exactly. For an enslaved person, submitting to sexual acts could be a means of survival, it could be something forced upon them as punishment, or just part of the daily terror and control of the system. It cannot be framed as a freely chosen relationship.
So even if same-sex acts did occur between, say, a pirate and an enslaved person on board, we simply cannot view them through the same lens as a relationship between two pirates of equal status, like matelots.
Precisely. The power dynamic negates the possibility of genuine consent. Now, that's not to say deep bonds couldn't form across racial lines in other contexts, but within the specific pirate-enslaved dynamic, the record is silent on consensual same-sex relationships, and the context makes them conceptually impossible.
Were there any known examples, though, of deep emotional bonds across racial lines, even if not explicitly sexual or within that pirate context?
There is one incredibly poignant example, actually. Olaudah Equiano.
Ah, the formerly enslaved man who wrote the famous autobiography.
That's him. He purchased his own freedom. In his autobiography, he writes about a profoundly close relationship he had with a young white man, a shipmate named Richard Baker, when Equiano was still enslaved but working at sea.
What did he say about it?
He described them as being inseparable for about 2 years. He wrote, and this is a direct quote, "We have many nights lain in each other's bosoms when we were in great distress."
Wow. That's powerful language.
It really is. He expresses deep, deep sorrow when Baker eventually leaves him. Now, the narrative doesn't explicitly state they had sex, but the language suggests a profound emotional and physical intimacy far beyond just ordinary friendship.
And that was omitted later.
Crucially, yes. Later abridgments of Equiano's book, especially those made for children, often cut out that specific intimate detail about them lying in each other's bosoms.
Again, that pattern of sanitizing or erasing potentially queer elements.
Exactly. It highlights that tendency.
So when it comes to the specific question of gay interracial sex among pirates involving enslaved people, we're essentially looking at a silence in the records, compounded by the impossibility of consent.
That's the most accurate way to put it. It's a kind of double obscurity, the general difficulty of documenting same-sex acts, combined with the profound racial prejudice and the brutal reality of slavery. The absence of evidence here likely reflects the impossibility of such relationships being openly recorded, let alone truly consented to within that power structure.
Even though pirate crews were diverse.
Yes, pirate crews were often remarkably diverse. Estimates suggest maybe up to a third of pirates in some crews during the Golden Age were black, many formerly enslaved. Some ships even operated with a kind of revolutionary equality regarding race, dividing loot equally.
But that was pragmatic.
Largely, yes. It was often about needing manpower, not necessarily a deep-seated abolitionist belief running through the whole crew. The underlying power dynamics and racial hierarchies of the wider world still existed, even in these rebellious outcast communities.
Okay. So, despite all these historical complexities, the silences, the difficulties of proof, the image of the queer pirate seems more potent and popular than ever today in fiction and media. What's driving that, do you think?
It's really fascinating, isn't it? What we're seeing is an active process of queer reclamation in modern storytelling.
Reclamation. How so?
Think about popular TV shows. HBO Max's Our Flag Means Death. It's basically a romantic comedy featuring multiple explicit LGBTQ plus relationships, with the central story being the love between Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard.
Yeah, hugely popular.
Hugely. And then there's Stars as Black Sails, a much grittier show, which eventually revealed that Captain Flint's entire motivation for becoming this fearsome pirate stemmed from the persecution and loss of his male partner back in England.
Right, Lord Hamilton, that was
Yeah.
a major part of this character.
Exactly. And these portrayals, even if they sometimes, take liberties with strict historical accuracy,
Which they often do.
they fulfill a really critical need for representation. They offer these aspirational narratives of queer love, queer strength, resilience, found family, often in a setting that symbolizes freedom and rebellion.
So creators are consciously connecting the pirate haven idea with a queer haven idea.
Some are, explicitly. David Jenkins, the creator of Our Flag Means Death, has talked about drawing parallels between historical pirate culture as a refuge for societal outcasts and the queer experience, and shaping the show's world to be deliberately queer positive.
It becomes less about strict history and more about finding a lineage, a connection, even if it means reimagining parts of that history, creating a space where queer identity can exist powerfully.
I think that's exactly it. The enduring appeal lies in that desire to find and celebrate historical figures or archetypes who challenge norms. It provides a kind of genealogy of queer existence, especially when so much actual queer history has been erased or hidden.
Yeah.
And you see this in fan communities too, right? People actively engaging with these tropes, writing fan fiction, discussing the character dynamics online. There's clearly a strong desire to see oneself reflected in these compelling, rebellious figures.
Okay, so after this deep dive, what are the main takeaways for you, the listener?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that the history of sexuality among pirates is just way more complex and nuanced than simple modern labels like gay or straight can capture.
Right, the labels don't really fit the past.
Exactly. We've seen that while explicit, undeniable evidence for specific relationships is scarce largely because of historical taboos and deliberate erasure, the unique environment of pirate ships did seem to foster different kinds of intimate bonds.
Like Matelotage.
Like Matelotage, which could blur the lines between friendship, economic partnership, and maybe romance or sex. And crucially, we've had to emphasize how the brutal power dynamics of slavery made the idea of consent for enslaved individuals simply impossible in that context.
Yeah, that's vital context. So it's really about understanding that history isn't just what's written down plainly. It's also about listening to the silences, recognizing what was hidden or suppressed, and seeing how those hidden stories are now being re-examined and sometimes reimagined through contemporary eyes.
And this process, looking at these hidden histories, it isn't just an academic exercise, is it? It feels important for understanding the breadth of human experience, maybe even for social justice today.
Absolutely. Maybe the final thought for you to consider is this. How might other marginalized groups throughout history, people whose stories were ignored, suppressed, or deliberately erased, also have vibrant, complex histories waiting to be uncovered?
Yeah, what happens if we approach the past with that same curiosity, that critical thinking, and a real willingness to look beyond the official records, beyond the obvious narratives? What other stories might we find?